It's 1300, the Middle Ages. Captured by the enemy and taken back to the castle keep. You are lowered into the floor. You can't put your arms in front of you. You can't turn. You can't sit. You can't move as the trap door closes above. You wonder if you'll ever be let out, or if you'll simply be forgotten. The Middle Period was a time of conquests for thrones, incredible pitched battles on horseback, and as it turns out, grisly isolation punishments. While imprisonment was hardly the punishment of the day, you were more likely to be chopped to pieces or something equally grisly. There was a wicked chamber hidden beneath the very basement of the castle. From France to Switzerland, from England to Ireland, bottle dungeons and oubliettes were a place to place a prisoner and quite possibly never see them again. Get ready for a revelation of isolation as punishment like you've never seen before. Ghastly enough for the Renaissance to disown it, and the 20th century to reclaim it. If we're talking about medieval imprisonment, the conversation should begin and end with the oubliette, derived from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. There were few fates worse than ending up in a medieval isolation cell. As the title suggests, an oubliette was a dungeon designed to make the imprisoned be forgotten by their very captors. Medieval imprisonment could take place in dungeons, a relative room or cell, and was not a typical punishment. One would only end up in a dungeon if they were awaiting a trial or a sentence. Traditional medieval dungeons are often a byword for a whole series of cells or physical punishment chambers. Yet a medieval dungeon as a cell was often little more than a plain single room with a heavy door or trapdoor in the ceiling above for access. The oubliette, on the other hand, was designed completely differently, and designed so you would easily be forgotten and likely not survive. The design itself of the oubliette was an exercise in maximizing physical discomfort and punishment, known to some as bottle dungeons. Oubliettes were incredibly narrow cells or pits for keeping prisoners in a state of extreme claustrophobia. Remarkable instances of oubliettes include ones so narrow you could only just accommodate the width of a human body. Yeah, only just, and that's standing upright. There would be no sitting, no lying down. A person imprisoned in an oubliette was serving his sentence bolt upright, with no rest, and likely to be forgotten. The only point of access to a bottle dungeon was a narrow drain directly above. Many have pointed to the above-grade access of the oubliette, suggesting these isolation chambers for prisoners being one-time latrines. No light, no underground, no room to move, and likely a god-awful smell. Are you getting why you wouldn't survive this yet? It's important to outline just how different a dungeon was from a bottle dungeon or oubliette. A dungeon was common and closer to the use of a modern jail than a prison. A prisoner kept in a dungeon could expect a trial or release. Oubliettes were intended to leave the person forgotten and or dead. The physical toll of the oubliette is undeniable, with the prisoner left to stand indefinitely, and no records show of how much a prisoner was watered or fed. Yet there was clearly another, more pointed desire for this isolation. That was all psychological. At a time when imprisonment wasn't a fashion of punishment, the bottle dungeon stood alone and unique. The lack of human contact, the near-permanent darkness, and probably unsanitary conditions were designed to break a person down internally, not physically. As for the duration prisoners were held in these isolation cells, it's entirely undefined and not so easy to work out. Remember, they were put in these narrow cells to be forgotten. A person could be left in an oubliette for days, but this was entirely at the whim of their captor. They could be left underground with no light for entire years. As a forgotten person, the prisoner would be prey to disease, deprivation, and most of all, neglect, entirely unlikely to survive. Given their far from common usage and their lack of judicial normalcy, there is not a great number of records or documentation kept on oubliettes. This being said, through archaeology and a delving of limited historical texts, many castle explorations have shown us evidence of their usage and existence. In fact, oubliettes have been found across various medieval castles and their ruins across Europe. Curiously, their locations are not specific to a particular region, suggesting that isolation cells, bottle dungeons, and oubliettes were a not-so-secret form of medieval punishment. Leap Castle in Ireland holds a legend of being one of Ireland's most haunted locations. The site would hold famed battles of the feuding O'Carrolls and O'Bannons, who would war for occupation of the castle. Built in approximately 1250 CE among its rich Irish lore and heritage, it also contains one of the ghastliest oubliettes you could ever imagine. On the floor of the oubliette at Leap Castle are a series of upright wooden spikes, sharpened for maximum effect. thrown in from 8 feet above. You can bet anyone thrown into this isolation chamber would not survive. Another unique, yet no less grim oubliette can be found in Warwick Castle in England. A bastion of medieval history, Warwick Castle was constructed for William the Conqueror within 2 years of his claiming the English throne in 1066. Though you can bet the French prisoners who were captured in battle were only horrified to find the oubliette waiting for them. Near all of the documentation covering oubliettes speak of an upright, vertical design to keep the prisoner on their feet, well beyond their capacity or desire to do so. Not the one at Warwick Castle. No, at Warwick Castle, the oubliette is closer to potholing punishment from hell. A long, narrow, horizontal space the prisoner would lie prone in, with sharp stones jutting up from the floor beneath. Needless to say, escaping this was as much agony as unlikely, and keeping one's sanity and morality was a tall enough order. Other infamous oubliettes include the one found at the Bastille prison in Paris, another found at Château de Chillon in Switzerland, and one discovered by archaeologists in Nottinghamshire, England. Oubliettes were at their most prevalent between 1100 CE and 1500 CE, the period from the High Middle Ages to the Late Middle Ages. As you can hear from the wicked designs and bloody sites they were situated on, this kind of medieval isolation was seldom survived. As the Renaissance ushered in an era of wisdom and classical learning to Europe as a whole, the brutality of the Middle Ages was seen as passé, to say the least. Moreover, the Renaissance was something of a warm-up act for the Enlightenment. Humankind's desire for knowledge, wisdom, and furtherance was the ethos of the time. There would be no room for archaic forms of agonizing physical punishment. No harsh and horrible punishments like isolation cells situated in former latrines, sometimes equipped with sharp stones and spikes. Those were unacceptable. In these new eras, adherence to a penal system and less punishment to death was the direction of the general trend. Elizabethan England would carry out some pretty grisly interrogations, yet these were more under the lens of religious persecution specific to the landscape than a societal norm. So thankfully, come around 1500 CE, the oubliette was in decline, a cause for relief and celebration all around, particularly for those prone to claustrophobia. Sadly, however, isolation cells were not only to be found in the medieval period despite Enlightenment ahead. No, despite Enlightenment and all things better and good to come to the continent of Europe, the 20th century would arrive full of revolution, war, prosecution, and hideous forms of punishment. Some of the brutal instances of physical punishment would take place in Soviet Russia's Gulag and the Nazi regime's concentration camps. Both would take millions of human lives across their operational running, and both would mark a return of isolation cells. During the Stalinist purges of the 1930s, there were standing cells in use, known as kishka. Accounts include people being removed after 2 days of standing, no room to move. It left them falling unconscious. In the Oranienburg concentration camp of Nazi Germany, there were 2 standing cells built in 1933, purposely built to barely over 30 inches in square diameter, just enough space for a person to be stood. One prisoner was held in this standing cell for a full 8 days and lost his mind as a result. Dachau also erected standing cells and held prisoners in there for days at a time. Disturbingly, standing cells were also erected at the Allach subcamp that were made even smaller than the chimney-sized Dachau constructions. Auschwitz would also have standing cells of such physical, grueling construction, only a 2-inch hole for air, yet 4 prisoners would be crammed inside. Survivors would testify being held in these cells for weeks at a time, and allege that one prisoner was so starved he attempted to eat his own footwear. This was Middle Ages torture brought into the 20th century, and once again, those taken prisoner were not likely to survive. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.